Those who come at 3. It's a strange feeling, being awake at 3 in the morning. You know, that deep, cold hour when the world feels suspended in time, and your mind begins to wonder about things you'd usually laugh off in the daylight. I've always been a night owl, or at least, I used to think of myself as one. But it was around the time I moved into this apartment, on the 5th floor of a building that looks like it's seen better days, that I started noticing something odd. It began quietly, like an itch in the back of your mind, something you'd ignore for as long as possible. Every night, at precisely 3 o'clock, I'd hear a faint tapping on the window. The first time it happened, I thought it was the wind. The second time, I blamed the neighbors. But after the third, I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was getting under my skin. It wasn't the kind of tapping you'd expect. Not a gentle knock or a soft rattle, but a rhythmic, deliberate sound, almost as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. A whisper in the night, as cold and persistent as the wind outside. But the wind didn't tap. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that it was some weird quirk of the apartment. But by the time the 6th night rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up in bed, the shadows of the room stretching across the walls like dark fingers. My breath was shallow, my heart beat too loud in the silence. 3 a.m. again. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. The glowing red numbers taunted me, mocking my indecision. The tapping had started again, right on cue. Only this time, it sounded closer. Like whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was listening. I threw the blanket off and swung my feet onto the cold wooden floor, the chill of the room sending a shiver through me. The apartment was silent, save for the incessant tapping. I moved to the window cautiously, each step slow and deliberate, trying to convince myself this was just some mundane occurrence. But when I reached the window, I hesitated. There was no real reason to be afraid, right? Maybe it was a bird, maybe a tree branch scraping against the glass. Something logical. Something explainable. But then I remembered the height. The 5th floor. Nothing should be able to tap like that, not from that angle. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the curtain, parting it just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. Not a single living soul, not a flicker of movement. The street below was empty, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. No one. Not a thing out of place. I laughed nervously to myself, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The tapping had to be some kind of mistake. My mind was playing tricks, nothing more. But as I was about to close the curtain, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the glass. The faintest outline. A shadow. It wasn't mine. I froze. It stood there, just outside the window, perfectly still. The figure was tall and thin, its shape barely distinguishable, but I could see it. In the reflection, I could make out the silhouette of something, or someone, standing there. No face, no detail, just a dark, elongated shape that didn't belong. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse began to race. I spun around, but the room was empty. The tapping had stopped. The shadow was gone. There was no one outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something had been there. Something had been watching me. I couldn't go back to sleep. The room felt too heavy, too alive with the memory of that shadow. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands shaking, heart pounding in my chest. The night seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? And what could I even say? I saw a shadow at my window? It sounded absurd. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That something, or someone, was waiting for me, coming to me at precisely 3 o'clock every night. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't be scared. I had to be brave, to prove to myself it was just my imagination running wild. But when the clock struck 3 again, I heard it, the same tapping, just as faint, just as rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through the dark. I didn't go to the window this time. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets to my chest, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. But then I heard something else. A whisper. It was so soft, so faint, that I wasn't sure at first if it was real or just in my head. But it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was like a murmur, a low sound that I couldn't make out. I couldn't even tell if it was human. My skin crawled as I realized that this wasn't just some figment of my imagination. There was something in the room with me. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. Its presence was suffocating. The tapping continued, but now there was something more, something just beyond my reach. Something that kept me awake, paralyzed with fear, wondering if I was the only one who could hear it. I didn't dare look out the window again. The shadow was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, like a stain I couldn't wash away. But I knew it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something that came for me every night at 3. The days dragged on, each one more suffocating than the last. The tapping never stopped. Every night, at precisely 3 o'clock, it would start, first soft and uncertain, then louder and more persistent, like a message from something beyond. It was always the same. The sound that crept into my ears, invading my dreams, breaking through the silence of the night. No matter how many times I tried to convince myself it was nothing, I knew deep down that it wasn't. There was something happening, something I couldn't explain, and I was powerless to stop it. I tried to find logic, something tangible to anchor my sanity. Maybe it was a bird, a squirrel, a strange weather condition, a construction site across the street, anything to explain what was happening. But none of these excuses held up when I stood at that window again, staring into the abyss of the empty street below. The tapping was not just a random occurrence, it was methodical, intentional. It knew when to start, it knew when to stop, and it knew exactly how to unsettle me. I started to dread the nights. Every evening, as the clock ticked closer to 3, the anxiety built inside me. My hands would shake, my heart would race, and I'd tell myself that it was just a few more hours before I could escape into the relative safety of daylight. But when 3 o'clock hit, I was wide awake, my body frozen in fear, waiting for the inevitable tapping. Then came the night when I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know. I had to face it. I had already spent too many hours sitting in the dark, staring at the same empty window, watching the shadows of the city dance across the streets. I couldn't just keep running from it. The fear, the unknown, it was worse than anything I could imagine. So, with a resolve I didn't know I had, I got out of bed that night, just as the clock struck 3. I moved quietly, my steps muffled on the cold wooden floor. I didn't want to give whatever was out there the satisfaction of knowing I was coming. But at the same time, I needed it to see me. I needed to face it. The tapping started, exactly as it always did. The steady, rhythmic sound like a call, a beckoning from the other side. My hand was already on the window curtain before I could second-guess myself. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I was no longer sure what I would find, or what I was hoping to find. I yanked the curtain aside, staring out into the darkness. The street was empty, just as it had been the countless nights before. There was no one there. No figure standing in the shadows, no strange shape lurking in the corner. Nothing. But as I started to close the curtain, a sick feeling crawled down my spine. There it was again. The shadow, but this time it wasn't in the reflection. It was outside the window, directly in my line of sight. I gasped, stumbling back from the window as the shape pressed itself against the glass. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body bent in unnatural angles that made my stomach twist. Its outline was sharp, but there were no features, no face, no eyes. Just an endless blackness that seemed to swallow everything around it. The tapping stopped. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I was frozen in place. My mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Was this real? Was I going insane? The more I stared, the less real it all seemed. It was like I was caught between two worlds, the world inside my apartment, and this thing, on the other side of the glass. I couldn't breathe. My throat was dry, and my legs felt weak beneath me. But then, before I could process what was happening, the shadow moved. It didn't step away. It just shifted. Slowly, impossibly, like the air around it had thickened and folded in on itself. And just as it moved, the tapping began again, louder this time, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out. But my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the very air was holding me in place. My heart pounded in my chest, a dull thudding sound filling my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow disappeared. Gone. No trace. No sign. It was as though it had never been there. My window was empty, as though I had imagined the whole thing. I stumbled back from the window, gasping for air, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the sill. For a long time, I stood there, staring out at the empty street, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense. Nothing fit. What I had seen, or thought I had seen, wasn't possible. It couldn't have been real. But when I turned to leave the window, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection. Something moving behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Nothing. But as I glanced back at the window, I saw it again. That shadow. It was there, pressed up against the glass, just as it had been before. Only now, it wasn't outside. It was inside, right behind me. I didn't look again. I couldn't. Instead, I ran. I ran from the window, from the room, from the apartment. I ran into the hallway, heart racing, hands shaking uncontrollably. The building was silent. The hallways were dark, the air thick with the weight of everything I'd just experienced. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The shadow, the tapping, the whisper. It had been waiting for me. It had been there, at 3 o'clock, every night. And I knew then that I hadn't seen the last of it. It would be back. It always came back. And this time, it wouldn't just be tapping at my window. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I had tried to tell myself that it was just a bad dream, that everything would be normal again. But deep down, I knew the truth. That thing, whatever it was real. It wasn't just some trick of the mind. I could still feel the weight of its presence, pressing in on me, suffocating the space around me. I spent hours pacing the apartment, my eyes flicking nervously to the clock on the wall. 3 a.m. was drawing nearer, and I couldn't escape the sensation that something was waiting. Something was watching. The tapping would start again, and I couldn't stop it. No matter how much I tried to prepare myself, I was powerless. The night felt darker than usual, the silence heavier. As the clock ticked closer to that cursed hour, I stood at the window, staring out at the empty street below. The streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving out there, hidden just out of sight. At precisely 3 o'clock, it began. The soft tapping against the glass, light at first, like a feather brushing the window. I froze. My hands were clammy, my body tense, every muscle screaming to move, to do something, anything. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the glass. The tapping grew louder. More insistent. Faster. The rhythm was steady, as if it was determined to make itself known, to force me to acknowledge its presence. I wanted to scream, to tear open the window and confront whatever was out there. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. Not yet. And then, as I stared at the glass, I saw it again. That shape. It was there, just like before, only this time, it was different. It wasn't standing outside the window. No, this time, it was right behind the glass, its form distorting, as though it were pressing against the window from the other side. The shadow stretched and twisted, its outline warping in unnatural ways. like it was made of smoke or darkness itself. I gasped, stepping back, my breath catching in my throat. It was closer this time. Closer than I had ever felt it. I could almost hear it, feel it, its presence overwhelming. My hands reached for the curtain, pulling it aside with shaking fingers, desperate to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no one there. No one outside. No one behind the glass. The street was empty, just like it had always been. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision, but the shadow, the shape, it was still there, lingering in my mind, haunting me. It was like a lingering taste in the back of my throat that I couldn't wash away. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was hammering in my chest, the blood pounding in my ears. My eyes stayed glued to the window, waiting, watching, but nothing happened. No more shadows. No more tapping. The night seemed still, too still. And then, just as I started to believe it was all in my head, just as I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined the whole thing, I saw it again. This time, the shadow wasn't outside the window. No, this time, it was inside. The reflection. It was me, standing there in the glass, but it wasn't. The figure in the reflection was slightly off, slightly distorted, like it was a mirror of me, but wrong. The outline of my face was sharper, more angular, the eyes too wide, too hollow. I could feel my pulse racing as I stared at the reflection. The shadow in the glass wasn't mine, it was something else, something that mirrored me, but wasn't me. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered just in front of the window. The shadow mimicked my movement, but then, in a moment that felt like an eternity, the figure in the glass didn't follow my lead. It stayed frozen, its hand pressed against the glass, just like mine, but its fingers were twitching. Twisting. Pulling away from the glass, inch by inch, as if it were trying to break free. I pulled my hand back in shock. My breath came in shallow gasps. What was this thing? Why was it mimicking me, copying my every move? I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just some trick of the light. This thing was real. And it knew me. It knew exactly who I was. I backed away from the window, unable to tear my eyes away from the reflection, from the shadow that was now staring back at me, its dark eyes hollow and empty, its presence suffocating. I could feel it. It was in the room with me, watching me, waiting. It wasn't just tapping at the window anymore. It was inside me, inside my mind, crawling into my thoughts. The room felt colder, the air thicker, and the clock ticked louder, as if mocking my fear, counting down the seconds until I would lose my grip on reality. The tapping started again, but this time, it wasn't just at the window. It was coming from all around me. It echoed off the walls, reverberating through the floorboards, vibrating in the air. I turned toward the door, the only way out, but before I could take a step, something stopped me. A whisper, a soft, barely audible voice, threading through the silence. It wasn't in my ear. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could pinpoint. It was everywhere. You're not alone. The words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. My mind screamed at me to escape, but my body refused to listen. The tapping stopped again, leaving only the heavy silence. I turned to look at the window one last time. The reflection was still there, still watching. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to understand, the shadow in the glass stepped forward. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something real. And it was coming for me. I stumbled backward, my heart thudding so loudly it felt like it was going to burst from my chest. My hands gripped the edge of the desk behind me for support, but my legs were shaking too violently to hold me up. I could feel the air growing heavier around me, the temperature plummeting, my breath turning into thick clouds that hung in the freezing silence. The shadow, no longer a reflection but something far more sinister, was moving, inching closer through the glass, its form slowly emerging from the dark void behind it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to run, to do anything, but my throat was locked. There were no words, no sounds, only the cold creeping into my bones, the relentless tapping still echoing in my ears. It felt like my own body was betraying me, refusing to do what I needed most, escape. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think clearly. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow. It was no longer mimicking my every movement. No. It was its own entity now. It had crossed the boundary between the reflection and the real world. The outline of the shadow was becoming clearer, its edges sharper, more defined, and as it grew closer to the glass, I could make out details that chilled me to my core. The eyes. Those hollow eyes. I had seen them before. They weren't mine. I knew it in my gut. They were black, void-like, staring straight through me, as though it could see every secret, every fear I had ever tried to bury. I felt exposed, like this thing knew everything about me and it was savoring the moment, savoring the terror that was slowly twisting inside of me. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the tapping began again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the apartment. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed off the walls, circling me, surrounding me. No, I whispered, but the word barely made it past my lips. No, no, no. I turned toward the door again. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to escape, but when I reached for the handle, I felt the coldness of the doorknob seep into my skin, and my hand froze there, unable to open it. My fingers were numb, my body trembling as I stood in place, helpless, trapped between the shadow at the window and whatever was lurking in the apartment with me. The tapping stopped again. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I had somehow won, that whatever was haunting me had finally retreated into the shadows from which it had come. But I was wrong. The window. The glass. The reflection. It wasn't just reflecting me anymore. It was showing something else. Something darker. Something twisted. The shadow in the glass stretched, its form growing longer, its hands reaching outward, as if trying to pull itself free from the confines of the window. And then, I saw it. The reflection, the shadow, smiled. A wide, grotesque grin split its face, its features contorting in ways that were impossible, unnatural. It wasn't a smile of joy. No, this was something else, something sickening, like it was mocking me, toying with me. It was a smile of malice, of pure evil, and in that moment, I realized something. Something terrifying. It wasn't just coming for me. It had already been here. The tapping resumed, but now it was no longer a simple sound, it was a command. A demand. I had no choice but to listen, to obey. Slowly, I turned back toward the window, my gaze locked on the thing that wasn't just a reflection. It was the thing that had been haunting me for days, for weeks, tapping at my window, waiting for me to finally acknowledge it. And I did. I stepped closer to the glass, the air growing colder with each step, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I reached out to the window, my fingers brushing the cold glass, and for the first time, I saw it in full, its form now completely visible, pressing against the glass, its face twisted into that unnatural smile. It wasn't a human face. It was something far worse. And as I reached for it, as my fingers brushed the glass, everything went dark. A moment later, I was standing in the middle of my apartment, the window before me, the shadow gone. The room was eerily still, and for a split second, I thought I had imagined it all. I thought I had somehow woken up from a nightmare, but then I saw it, the reflection in the glass. I wasn't alone. The shadow wasn't just outside the window. It wasn't just a trick of the light. No, it was standing beside me. Its face pressed against the glass, its eyes dark and hollow, its grin wide and filled with something otherworldly. It had crossed over. And I wasn't sure who was the prisoner anymore. Me? Or it. I don't know how long I've been standing here, staring at the window, unable to move. The clock in the room ticks on, but I can't hear it. All I hear is the soft, rhythmic tapping, just behind me. Just behind the glass.